Hi everyone, we're continuing with assessment and diagnosis in this part of the module and focused on some different assessment approaches. I've talked a bit about a few of these, including different types of interviews, talking a bit about symptom and well-being measures, talked briefly about personality assessment, cognitive assessment. We'll go a little bit more in depth here. But there's just so much to these different components. So we're really just gonna kind of touch the surface. I do want to point people to an example that you can access through the slides. There's a YouTube link here. And I would like for people to try to think about whether this example interview is unstructured or structured. We have a clinician and an actor who are basically role-playing this interview. And so I'd like you to think about, is this something that seems to have more structure or less structure in terms of the way that the clinician is asking the questions? Just try to get a feel for it. And again, when we're thinking about structured versus unstructured interviews, again, like the key here is that we're thinking about, is there a guide that the clinician is using that they have set up that is helping them to go through their different questions that they have for the client or the clients who are in front of them. So there's different types of structured interview modules. I mentioned a couple. This is one of the modules. I know this is very small probably on your screen, but a depression supplement to the KSADS, semi-structured interview for assessing different types of disorders in children. And this one is semi-structured, meaning that there's some flexibility to asking the question. So if I were to do an unstructured interview and ask the client something like, so tell me a bit about what brings you in. Maybe they were to mention something about, feeling down and depressed, maybe feeling bad about themselves. I would be able to then kind of use my clinical judgment to follow up about symptoms that I know are part of depression and other symptoms that I know may be kind of relevant. So asking about different types of anxiety, things like that. I would definitely want to understand the person's life circumstances. So I would sort of have a general strategy for going through it, but I wouldn't really have kind of any sort of clear guide necessarily. Although you do get better with experience at asking, doing unstructured interviews. With a more structured interview, including semi-structured, for example, if I had questions about depression, there's a guide that I can use. So I can ask different types of questions about symptoms. And so some of the questions would be something like, given how you've been feeling, if someone tried to cheer you up, would they be able to? That would be one way of asking it. Or has anything good happened to you since you started feeling more down lately? And then so I would kind of ask some questions in that direction based on the supplement. A question for a child or adolescent, help me to understand something like, is this more depression or is it something like grief? So this question, I would ask something like, is this feeling that you've been talking about in terms of feeling down, is that something that is different than when you would get, like if a friend moved away or if your parent went out of town for a while? So that'd be a type of question that is coming from a semi-structured interview, but is getting at some specific symptoms that I would actually be, as a clinician, I would be kind of checking off as I went through. And again, with some people's answers, sometimes it's really clear that yes, that definitely fits. Either that's happened now or that's happened in the past. Or, maybe it's clear that it's not there. Again, we're able to kind of rule out that symptom. Or it's kind of in the middle. We would maybe think about it as like subthreshold or maybe a question mark. And so there's some different ways to kind of track that with some semi-structured and structured interviews. But again, I would ask people to take a look at this example. It's very short, it's about 8 minutes or so. And think to yourself, is this more of an unstructured or structured interview or semi-structured? Let's get to personality assessment. And I wanted to bring up a distinction that they talk about in the book with this idea of objective versus subjective. Now, this is something that is a little bit confusing because really whenever we're doing any sort of measurement, we're doing our best to be objective. We're doing our best to sort of base it off of real data and things that we can see. But we're still having to kind of do our best to get at things that are really hard to measure, things like personality or depression or things like that. So with objective personality assessment, really what we're saying is that there's, there's good face validity to those instruments. You know, in general, there's pretty good face validity. And it's pretty clear that those measures have validity for what they're measuring. So it's a good measure of something like a person's extroversion, for example. Subjective personality assessment is something that is talked about more with projective testing. So those projective tests, like the Rorschach, like the thematic apperception test. And again, this is something where there's not really kind of clear links between information that you can get from those tests and what they're supposed to be tapping into. So if you see that kind of ink blot from the Rorschach in the book, what is it that psychologists are kind of reading into that? So that little, I think I might have made a face there, but that it's kind of giving you some indication of how I think about projective testing. So projective tests are used. I'll get into those a little bit. But again, we sort of have this distinction between things that we think are more objective versus things that we think are more subjective in terms of personality assessment. There's also one key distinction that I wanted to bring up, and this is probably across both objective and subjective, but in particular is around some different ways of developing personality assessments for objective assessments. So I want to give a couple of different examples, and the first one is an example of an empirical test development process with the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, the second edition. And there's a new one that I think is coming out in the next couple of years here. But I would be glad to kind of talk about this measure a little bit, and I definitely recommend that people have your book pulled up as well. But the MMPI-2 is one that is pretty widely used in clinical psychology. And really what's interesting about this test is that the questions that were developed on this test, there's about 567 true-false questions or statements where a client or someone is asked to basically say whether that statement is true or false about themselves. That those questions didn't come up because scientists were thinking about, how do we best measure depression? How do we best measure anxiety? What they did is that they sort of took groups that already existed, people with depression, people with anxiety, people with schizophrenia, people with substance use problems. And this is going back decades into like the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when a lot of this work was going on. And what they did is they took those groups and then they developed some questions, a lot of questions, and they basically tried to see which ones were best at differentiating between people in these different groups. And they had, again, people in groups with different psychological disorders that had been identified through a diagnostic process. They had people that they called healthy controls. I'm putting that in quotations because that was sort of how they defined it. And again, they tried to see, do these items really distinguish between these different groups? And they used things like correlations or whether the means on those items were different for the different groups. So I'll take a second and stop the screen share with the PowerPoint, and I'm going to share the my screenshot of the textbook and just help you to kind of understand, how psychologists use information that we get from those types of profiles. So the MMPI, again, is something that has been, developed under development for a long time, that there's now a second version. And again, I mentioned that likely a third version coming out fairly soon. And those, the large number, 567 items, that those are boiled down into lots of different types of scales and subscales. So over the years, psychologists have done a lot of work to try to understand different clusters of items and kind of what those items mean and interpreting those different items. One of the things that's really nice about the MMPI, in particular and some other personality assessment measures, is that these tests, these measures, assessment measures, have what we call validity indices. Now, what that means is that these tests have some different ways of helping us to understand a person's response set or their response style to the questionnaire, that measure that's in front of them. And there's some different ways that we can kind of look at that. We can look at their consistency in terms of how they respond to items that should be responded to similarly. We can look at their responses to items in which everyone responds to infrequently, including people with severe psychopathology. We can look at their responses to items that ask about very, very minor things that could be considered like a fault, or things that might be hard to admit to for certain people. So something like, do you always brush your teeth twice a day? Or some of the questions from MMPI, original MMPI, were something like, do you read every single editorial in the newspaper every day? And so those questions help us to kind of understand whether a person is maybe more likely to try to portray themselves in a more positive light or maybe a more negative light. And part these are useful because there are definitely some situations when psychologists are doing assessments when people may have some potential incentives to either play up some different things that they're experiencing or play down different things that they're experiencing, either exaggerate or kind of minimize. And again, it's not meant to be a value judgment in terms of why people may do that, but that's just one of the things that people have noticed with these different types of personality assessments. So on the left-hand side here, we have some validity indices. And again, I won't go through each of these, but again, psychologists are sort of reading through each of those and kind of understanding someone's response style through that. And then on this right-hand side, this is really just kind of the main profile page that you get. There's lots of other pages in this type of report, but you get a kind of profile of that person's kind of the main things that characterize their responses, and then things that maybe are more or less difficult. And so there are 9 scales here, 10 scales. And a couple of those are ones that we don't pay as much of attention to. Maybe they're a little bit helpful. This MF scale and this SI scale over here. I don't think that those are actually part. I can't remember if those are part of the, yeah. So the MF scale is here, but it's kind of put in this little marker, and the SI scale, social introversion. So those don't really kind of get factored into the overall profile, but we read this and we try to understand what are the places where the profile is most elevated. And then there are some different tools that help us to kind of understand what that might mean for that person who is filling it out. Assuming we have a valid profile, kind of understanding how a person approached the test, we can sort of read this and we can say the highest scale is the 2. That would be, depression there. And it would be, it looks like 7 or 8 in there. And so there's some different ways that we can think about these. The names of the scales, depression, for example, here, hysteria, psychopathic deviant, we don't really use those terms anymore. We use scaled numbers for those. And then there's information down here that really is just telling us standardized scores. These are T-scores for where a person is falling. And those T-scores are the things that are plotted over here. So you can see 95 for scale 2, and that's kind of right around that 95 number there. So you can see kind of where those numbers are coming from. And there's a part of the profile that kind of plots it according to whether that person is a male or female respondent. It tells you whether items are missing. So there's lots of different pieces of information to interpreting a profile and make it very complicated. So this gets to the ethical component that I was talking about in the last segment in terms of the qualifications that are needed. So you wouldn't want someone that doesn't have really, really good training in interpreting this to take your answers and say, I think based on my initial read, I think this is what you're struggling with, or I think this is your personality. So this is just, again, another, hopefully from the complexity of this, you get that sense of qualifications for reading tests are very important. And there's other objective personality measures that are out there. There's an adolescent version of the MMPI-2, for example, MMPI-A. There's the Milan MCMI. There's the personality assessment inventory. Lots of other ones that could be relevant to use. And again, we make choices based on what is the best fit for the referral question and the best fit for that client, and kind of the ones that we're best trained in. So I gave you an example of some objective personality assessments that are based more on sort of empirical basis, meaning that, again, they're sort of looking more at let's just try to differentiate between groups. But there are personality assessments that are based more off of conceptual or theoretical development. So one of the biggest and most important models of personality is the Big Five. And you can kind of think about the OCEAN acronym: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So the OCEAN acronym right there is how we think about that. And this is one that is based off of a theory and what we would call a conceptualization of the main domains of personality. And again, the Big Five is the one that stood the test of time as being the best kind of description of personality as a whole. There's lots of other kind of smaller traits or kind of parts of these bigger traits, but these are the ones that kind of best describe personality people have found. And that's true across cultures. That's not just something that's been tested in the US. So I wanted to just mention that idea of empirical test development, but then also conceptual or theoretical test development. I also encourage people to check out this link. I think it's about 50 items, a personality assessment measure, focus on the Big Five factor model. You get a little bit of feedback for where you fall. So I would take that questionnaire, and again, you can get some results and maybe learn a bit about yourself. So you may notice that I haven't used other types of personality assessment measures. So there are definitely a lot of pop personality assessment measures out there, like pop culture, things you can find online, things that show up on Facebook, like what personality type are you? And so I just want to differentiate that there's a lot of stuff out there that isn't very well evidence-based. And there are some really good personality measures out there that are evidence-based. So those are the things that psychologists sort of are paying attention to understand, again, what are the best measures to use for doing personality assessment with clients. So again, this would be a component of a larger assessment process and assessment test battery with a client in many cases. Projective tests, again, I wanted to just run through that briefly. I think the book does a good job of running through a couple of the main ones that are used out there. It's important to know that projective tests are fairly commonly used in certain areas of the field, and in some ways in certain areas of the country. So for example, my understanding is that projective tests are used a lot more like in the Northeast, like New York, compared to on the West Coast, so bigger cities on the West Coast. I don't know how much they're used in different parts of the middle of the country, but they're fairly commonly used in different areas of the field, but they're really controversial in terms of their scientific evidence. So as the book talks about, the Rorschach, for example, has a very complicated scoring scheme. There's some okay research on it, but there's just a lot of questions about the validity of those measures, of those projective tests. So here again is a chance for you to think about what you've learned about so far in this module in terms of aspects of reliability and validity that are important to think about with test and assessment. How would you apply those to projective tests? So concepts like reliability, the idea of test-retest reliability, for example, the idea of inter-rater reliability for projective tests. How do you think that would kind of work? Or what do you think would be a type of study that could be done to kind of get at those? So with test-retest, you might maybe thinking about the idea that someone would take a projective test like the Rorschach, at one time point, and then maybe 6 months later, 8 months later, come in and do that same thing again. We would try to compare their scores and see the consistency. If the projective test is, measuring something that we think is pretty stable, which personality should be pretty stable, then those scores should be pretty highly correlated. And I think there's some question marks about the test-retest reliability of that. Same thing with inter-rater reliability, that for the when people were doing interpretations of projective testing, you would have clinicians who were getting to very different conclusions about a person's personality and who they were based off of how they interpreted the person's responses to those different stimuli. So they're the different ink blots that people maybe rated those differently. And so that's why the book kind of talks about how the really careful coding system was developed, a really complicated coding system. Takes a long time to learn. That is supposed to help with inter-rater reliability, but again, still some concerns there. And then validity, that, for face validity in particular, with projective tests, and especially the Rorschach, what is face validity there? Is face validity high or low? And is that a good thing, or maybe is that a bad thing? What would we be looking for in terms of convergent validity, criterion validity? And so try to think about some of those concepts that we've talked about, and kind of what may be helpful in terms of understanding validity with projective tests. Like, what types of information would you want to see, knowing what you know about validity after the last segment? I also wanted to just bring up this idea of general versus specific measures for psychological problems and well-being. The book talks about a couple of examples, a global assessment of functioning, for example, the general health questionnaire as being general measures of psychological problems. I've been involved and led the development of a measure called the Brief Adjustment Scale, with 6 items. And so that is one that is now available for researchers and clinicians to use. And that measure asks about people's mood, sort of their depression level, their anxiety, and their irritability. And also asks about how those different problems are getting in the way of their life in terms of their relationships, their work, and school, for example. Let's contrast those general measures with more specific measures. So we might want to track something like depression or anxiety or substance use, or negative symptoms in schizophrenia, substance dependence problems, lots of different things that we might track. And so if we're thinking about assessment, what are the pros and cons of thinking about using a general measure versus a more specific measure? So to me, general measures can be useful really in any type of assessment case. If you're just doing assessment and not doing treatment with someone, then they tend to be a little bit less useful. I think they're especially useful if you're doing treatment following an assessment and you want to track change in general psychological functioning over time. Specific measures can be really useful as well. And so to me, these are always things to include, like specific target problems or behaviors that you want to track. But the con to these is that with clients who have complex presentations, that it's really hard to summarize how they're potentially getting better over time in that outcome assessment phase. So again, there's some pros and cons to both of these types of measures. I think the chapter talks just a little bit about those, but again, to me, it's useful to sort of balance the idea of measuring a general, having a general measure, having a more specific measure. I want to talk briefly about the assessment of cognitive functioning. There's a lot of different areas that can be assessed for in cognitive functioning assessment. Things like language, memory, attention and concentration, motor skills, perception, abstraction abilities, the idea of thinking less concretely and more abstractly, and learning abilities. The phrase that is used in the book is the idea of kind of set shifting with the Wisconsin card sort task. So learning new rules over time and being able to kind of apply those in the moment rather than just sticking with one rule in the same way throughout a task. So this is really all about brain functioning, all about how people think and how their minds work. And so a lot of different things that we might want to track. And these tend to fall into kind of 2 separate but related types of tests, including neuropsychological tests and then intelligence tests. So both of these types of tests are meant to tap into different types of cognitive functioning, but they oftentimes do it in different ways. And you get measures of problem solving, measures of, for example, motor skills, measures of attention and concentration, abstraction abilities, oftentimes in both types of tests. In general, with neuropsychological tests, again, what we're aiming to do is understand brain functioning and then be able to kind of understand how brain functioning might have changed as a result of potentially an acute incident, like an accident or something like that, or potentially as a result of a more chronic condition or the onset of some sort of health condition. And so tests can help with, for example, tracking the onset and progression of something like dementia or Alzheimer's. One of the tests that's been in the news a lot lately, well, not recently, but a couple of months ago or a month ago, it's hard to know what time is these days, but there's a test called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test, the MoCA, that came up a lot in the news. And let me actually pull it up just really briefly, because I thought it would be useful to kind of show people what that measure looks like. So this is what the examiner sees and kind of scores for the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Measure, and some different things that people are asked to do in terms of, again, drawing a line between different parts here, copying this cube, drawing a clock, naming different animals, memory and attention. That's the part that probably got the most attention, most news coverage. And again, you can kind of see what these different items are getting at here. And you can feel free to pause and look through that a bit more. So this is an example of a neuropsychological test that is used for multiple things, including, again, looking at brain functioning in the context of Alzheimer's or dementia assessment or stroke assessment, things like that. And so that's something that again, may be of interest to people. But intelligence tests, on the other hand, tend to think about intelligence as a stable between individual difference. And the tests are designed to kind of understand where a person falls in terms of their intelligence level. This is really complicated. There's a lot of, I think, controversy about this. One of the main take-home points from the book, and something that I want you to think about, is that we don't take these as the end-all be-all of what intelligence is really all about. That you get multiple types of scores on these different measures, and sometimes you can boil it down to one score, but it's by no means is that the only indicator of intelligence levels or what intelligence really means. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. And there's all kinds of different measures. It take a lot of training to be able to administer well. And these are oftentimes used more in clinical assessment in terms of the school or helping people to get accommodations for different types of skills deficits, for example, and are another kind of key role that psychologists and other types of mental health professionals are involved in. But psychologists in particular are really involved in these, in this type of assessment. I also thought I'd mention, I've talked about the idea of clinical psychology before. So that's one area of psychology. Neuropsychology is one kind of sub area of clinical psychology. And so there are neuropsychologists out there that work specifically around neuropsychological and intelligence tests, and that's really their main area of focus. So it's such a complicated area that you can actually specialize in testing and the interpretation of tests and doing research on tests. So I thought I would mention that if your interest is kind of sparked. So thank you. Coming up next, behavior modification, or sorry, behavioral observation, behavioral assessment, and then some more on the diagnostic system.